I think that, well, what would apply to you guys, because I think the other one is a Psych 101, we'll be doing abnormal psych. Okay, sorry everyone, I turned off the wrong one. So for those who are online, the Psych 240 will be synchronous, kind of like what we're doing here. And then there's also, for those who are interested, a Psych 214 abnormal, which is asynchronous online for those who are online students. So look for those. And there's also, just kind of expanding, there's also what's called SOAP 127. It's family and marriage for those who are kind of thinking about going into the social sciences, either social work or psychology or sociology, or working with people. That's a really good class to have under your belt. So that's kind of what we have this coming spring. So take a look and check it out. Okay. Now back to what we were doing. Okay, so we, as mentioned last week, we have two kinds of memory systems. We have our short-term memory systems, which again, analogous with a computer, is kind of the RAM, the random access memory, the memory you use to run programs, those kinds of things. And then we have the long-term memory, which is our hard drive, right? So it's what stores the information that we work with in our short-term memory. So far, we found that the long-term memory, based on neural connections, all that kind of stuff, we haven't found its limit. We think it's pretty well unlimited based on the millions of cells that are involved and then the billions of connections that are possible. Is it possible for those memories to be lost? In reality, no. Unless there is some damage to that area of the brain, or you no longer use that information whatsoever and there's decay. Okay. But pretty much we'll get into why do we forget, right? What is it that makes it so we don't remember certain things? And we'll get into that as we move along. Because these two different memory systems also work off different areas of the brain that are more adept to retrieving memories, okay? So within our long-term memory system, we basically have two types of memory systems. We have our explicit long-term memory, or what's called declarative memory. So these are the things you can talk about, the memories that you can express, okay? We have two types. We have episodic memories, which is memories for events. So they're kind of your autobiographical memories, things that you remember, like birthdays or holidays or what you did yesterday, for that matter. And then we have semantic memories. These are memories for quote unquote facts. These are memories for 2 + 2 = 4. What is the definition of semantic memory? These are kind of what you're doing. These are the memories you're trying to create in the college classroom, okay? Then we have implicit long-term memories. And these are what we call non-declarative memories, meaning that we can't necessarily say how it's done, but we can do it, okay? So there's a couple types of these. There's procedural memories. This is, for example, how to get in your car. It's the procedure of if you're in a sport somehow, you don't necessarily know, for example, with basketball, how you're dribbling the ball, but you're doing it, okay? Riding a bike is another good example of a procedural memory. And then we have classical conditioning. And this is kind of associative memories, okay? Going back to the previous section. This is why when we come into this classroom, if we're students, we sit down and take out a notebook. If you're an instructor, you put up some slide and talk about it. And so, or what happens when you walk into a kitchen and get hungry, all of those types of things that kind of tell you what you should be experiencing in the place that you're in. And then there's priming. Priming is something that sets you up for some type of behavior, okay? Probably the best example of priming is if you wake up really grumpy and you have a horrible morning, you're more than likely to experience the day in a horrible way, and you're more likely to make kind of bad decisions to reinforce that bad day. Okay. So these are the types. And if we look at it graphically, this is kind of what it looks like. And the question becomes, okay, so of these memory systems, which are the most robust? And if we were to say which one has the most staying power, it would be our implicit memory, okay? And it kind of goes back to that saying, once you ride a bike, you'll always be able to ride a bike, whether it's 20 years later or 5 years later or the next day. It's the fact that when you walk into a kitchen, you get one other memory of what to do there versus walking into a bedroom, okay? So these are the most robust memories. They're the ones that can drive a lot of our behavior. And then when it comes to explicit memories, the more robust memory system when it comes to explicit memory is episodic memories, okay? Memories for events, okay? And that's why in a lot of your classes, what I would really encourage you to do is when you're learning something, learn it from a experiential perspective. Learn it from this is an experience. It's not about learning these facts. It's about learning, it's about having the experience of what you're learning, okay? This is also why it's, this is easy to do in a psychology class, but anything that you can connect to a memory or to of an episode of some type or an experience, the better, okay? This is why in a lot of like social science discussion things, they say, explain this theory, and then they say, how does this apply to your life, or how does this apply to your career, okay? Because once we can make those connections, our semantic memories become more robust, okay? And on the other side of this too, is the more emotional the memory, the more it stays, because it connects with the emotional areas of the brain, okay? So the more emotional experience you have with something, the more likely it will be remembered. So this is just a little bit more on the declarative memory or the explicit memory. This, again, it's conscious recall, what we can verbally state happened, okay? And this study goes, though, goes back to, well, how much can we remember over time? So in 1984, they did, a lot of colleges do the Spanish class, and they want to know how long can someone remember Spanish after they've learned it. So, and this is kind of what they found when it comes to this explicit memory, okay? As you can see, they had non-Spanish speakers and what they retain over time. So this one here is time, so it's the number of years. And this is a percentage of original vocabulary that they remembered from their Spanish class. And if you notice, it takes about 6 years and we lose about 50% of what we learn if we don't use that information anymore, okay? And then after that, there's still a steady decline. So this is in essence kind of what, especially when it comes to semantic memories, okay? This is an example of how quickly it can decay over time if it's not constantly used, okay? And this is also why I mentioned earlier, if you can connect a memory with an emotion, emotions happen more frequently. And so it will connect to those memories and keep those memories going for a longer period of time. And this is kind of just what we went over. Those are weird looking slide. So this is autobiography, and this, of course, is knowledge for the world. Okay. And this is just a comparison of the two, okay? So episodic memories, again, are events, facts. The organization, when we think about episodic memories, we think about it in time from start to finish, for example. And then semantic memories is memories for concepts, okay? When we get to the abnormal section, we'll talk about schizophrenia, okay? And schizophrenia is a disorder that often hear about hallucinations, those types of things. But one of the major symptoms of schizophrenia is disorganized thinking, okay? And the thing that we've learned about people with schizophrenia is they actually have a better semantic memory than an episodic memory, okay? Because they can't recall a story from beginning to end. Their brains are such that they'll, let's say that, A to Z, right? They might start with A, go to F, come back to D, and then totally forget what they were talking about and start talking about Boeing and Walmart, okay? And so, and we're talking more of the severe type of schizophrenia, but this is why they really do have a better memories for concepts than they do experience, okay? Emotions, when we talk about emotions, when it comes to episodic memories, we tend to remember those memories that are more emotionally latent. So, for example, probably remember high school graduation, for those who were around then, 9/11, all of those very emotionally based experiences, okay? Retrieval for episodic is more deliberate, whereas semantic, it's more automatic. Either you know the concept or you don't. So, again, I'll go back 2 + 2. You don't really have to think about it equals 4, right? I hope. Education with episodic memory, irrelevant, and intelligence level, irrelevant. And then, of course, when it comes to semantic memories, these both become very relevant in being able to learn and understand. Okay? The one thing that a lot of people don't know, but in legal testimony, your experience is admittable in courts, but semantic memories are not, okay? So even when a person says that there's a DNA match, okay, they can't use the facts of the test and submit that to the court and say, this is a fact. This is the data, okay? Now in court, they have to bring in that forensic expert, and the forensic expert has to tell the story of how they became to those results. They can't just say it was a 99% match. They have to say, we did this, and this is what happened, this was the experience, and based on my professional experience, you notice the difference, not based on the test, but based on my professional experience, this is what we concluded, okay? So it's kind of an interesting thing. You can't use data in court, but you can use person's story. It's kind of interesting to think about. Okay. And then just as far as areas of the brain that we've looked at, we have the frontal lobe, which really deals with episodic memories. When we look at the amygdala and the temporal lobe, we're looking at more explicit memories that are done with priming, more emotionally based. And then the hippocampus, it deals more with explicit memories. In fact, what we found about the hippocampus is that it probably is the primary storage area. We're finding that the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the amygdala, and even the cerebellum are accessing the hippocampus when it's trying to process some type of memory, okay? And then, of course, the cerebellum, if you remember, controls coordinated movement, words, those types of things. So those are the systems that are at play. And as I gave an example, when we talked about this, damage to the cerebellum creates it so people can't talk correctly because they can't organize those words. They have trouble walking, they have balance issues and all those kinds of things. And just a little bit about health and wellness. We know that the role of the autobiographical memory is about learn from our experience, develop a sense of identity, and bond with others. It's kind of interesting when we think about things like morality, as an example, okay? When is it that a person who is going through Alzheimer's or a type of dementia, when is it do they lose a sense of morality? Okay? Meaning what's right and what's wrong, okay? And it's interesting because it's not the danger areas of the brain or that area that you would think someone would say this is a good action or this is a bad action, or that this is a good person, this is a bad person. No, it's actually the area of the brain that deals with identity and self-concept, and who you are as an individual. Once that area of the brain is destroyed, the ability to tell the difference between a moral and unmoral act leaves the individual with dementia, okay? So this idea of autobiographical memory, that sense of identity, the sense of who you are is what gives you things like your moral compass, as you would say. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to social psychology. But memory and aging, indicators of brain function. The thing that I would say about memory and aging is that it's a myth that a person has huge declines unless they get some type of dementia or some type of organic disease to the brain. The idea that we lose memory over time or lose the capacity to have memories over time is kind of a myth. What actually happens over time and why we see declines in the general population is because we stop engaging ourselves in the world as we start to age. People who isolate themselves from the world, people who stop reading and learning and all those kinds of things tend to have the larger declines. Okay? So the issue of memory and aging has to do with the interaction the person has with their world. The more engaged the person remains in the world, the less declines we see in aging. So keep active, everyone. Okay. So now let's talk just for a few minutes about reasoning and decision making. Okay? And we basically have two systems when it comes to reasoning and decision making. The first one is an automatic system. It's what we do without thinking. Okay. The second one is a controlled system. It's the one that we have to put effort into. Okay. So, for example, automatic systems. It's rapid. It uses heuristics. It's intuitive. If we look at first impression research, okay, whether you're going to like someone or not like someone, okay, a lot of people say, well, it depends. It probably takes days, weeks to decide if I'm going to like this person, if I'm going to enjoy being around them, or if I'm going to hate them. But actually, what predicts whether someone will like or dislike someone the best happens in the first 1.5 seconds of interaction with another person. In that 1.5 seconds, if you kind of do some withdrawal behaviors or you do approach behaviors, predicts whether or not you will like that person down the road or dislike that person down the road. Okay? And this relies on the automatic system. This automatic system that uses what's called heuristics, which is mental shortcuts. So first of all, we see, oh, this person is like me, they talk like me instantly, that you use their body language, you use all their facial expressions, and that, based on that heuristic you have for someone, bam, predicts whether you'll like them down the road or not, okay? The control system is the one that we think we use to determine whether we like someone or not, okay? And I'm not saying the control system can't override that automatic process, because it can. I mean, you can still develop a relationship with someone that automatic system said no, but it becomes very difficult. A lot of times these are the ones that we're forced into, like a job or a school. Okay, you don't really get that choice, so you have what's called a mere exposure thing, where you start liking them over time because of their mere presence. Okay. So when it comes to decision making, we do have some biases that we need to talk about. Whoops. Okay. Now, the way I want you to think about these biases, the way to think about these biases is the more stressed we become, the more likely we'll use these heuristics and biases. Okay. So the first one is what's called a confirmation bias. And this is when we search only for information that supports our ideas. Okay. And it's kind of interesting because the confirmation bias is why a lot of people can't get over things like prejudice and discrimination, because they'll only look at information that supports their position, and in a lot of times ignore completely information in the counter. Okay. And again, a lot of research on this, you get the participant a little bit stressed, and then you send them into their day, and you see what they do. And what we find is that the person becomes more and more closed-minded. Closed-minded in that they only seek out information that supports their idea or their position, okay? And we can kind of see this, in the online world, where people will only, for example, look at conservative or liberal news or conservative or liberal news feeds, and completely ignore anything from the other side. It's kind of that idea. Okay. Hindsight bias is the tendency to report falsely that we predicted an outcome of something. So it's when you always say, "Oh, I knew that would happen after it happened, but not before." Okay. Availability heuristic is predicting the probability based on easy of recall. So this is when a good example of this is people who go through some type of abuse or relationship abuse. Okay, and if it constantly happens, a lot of survivors of, for example, domestic violence will view all men as domestic abusers, or if it's a male who was abused, they will see all females as abusers. And so, because that's their availability of what they know, of the most salient information they know about people, and then they go into a confirmation bias, where then they only seek out that information that supports those ideas. Okay. Base rate fallacy is when we ignore info from general principles. This is kind of how do I put this one? This is when we view an event and we don't think about what created that event in the first place. So, for example, mob behavior, all right, or rioting behavior. Let's say it's rioting behavior in a protest. That's what I'm thinking of. Okay, we tend to only think that certain people will riot in a protest. Okay, but then we forget, and this is why this is called the base rate fallacy, is that we assume that there's something wrong with those people. They're violent, they're mean, they're out to destroy things. But then we forget what happens at major games, football games and baseball games, when people's favorite team loses, especially in a hometown. That also creates rioting behavior. But when we're viewing one group versus another group, we tend to ignore that base rate, that there's something about the situation that creates rioting behavior. It usually has nothing to do with the people who are actually rioting. Okay, and so that's kind of what's meant by base rate, is we kind of forget that everybody has the potential to riot, dependent upon the situation. And then the representative heuristic is making judgments based on stereotypes. Okay, so, and again, as we get more and more stressed, the more and more likely we'll use this type of stereotype. Okay, probably some good research in this, and we'll get into it again when we get into social psychology, is what's called the Shelley studies back in the 80s and 90s. And what they did during this research is they gave a measure of stereotype, negative stereotype, prejudice, and those, and we ended up with two groups: people who scored high in prejudice and people who scored low in prejudice. Okay, and then we had them go do some type of task. And in this task, what's going to happen is someone of a different race. So if it's a white person who's the participant, will have like a Black Confederate do something that requires help. Okay. In the first case, we have them just walk to the end of the hall and grab a pencil or something and walk back. Okay. And what's going to happen is the person, the Confederate working for the experiment, is going to drop something, is going to do something that then would require helping behavior. Okay. And so the people who just were told to go walk and stuff, the people were highly prejudiced, acted highly prejudiced. The people who said they were not prejudiced acted not prejudiced by engaging in helping behaviors or name calling or those kinds of things. Those were kind of the measures that were used. In the second condition, you had people go down and pick something up at the end of a hallway and bring it back, but they had to count backwards from 500 to 0 in 3s, 7s, and 6s. Okay, so they had to go 500, then it's 3, right? 497, and then 7, 490, and then 6, 484. And they had to do that. That's what we call a cognitive load. We're loading the system. Basically, what we're doing is stressing the system. Okay. And they went back and they went forth. Again, the people who scored high in prejudice acted prejudice. But the interesting thing was the people who said they weren't prejudiced. They actually acted just as prejudiced as the people who scored high in prejudice. Okay. And this is the example, like with the representative heuristic, we're more likely to use a stereotype that was given to us from society and through experience and stuff like that when we have a huge cognitive load, when we're extremely stressed. Okay. And this is that's an example of using a representative heuristic. Do those make sense? Yeah. And just as mentioned, so mood influences the way we think. This is kind of an interesting thing. Maybe if you have to go do a math test, don't go do it in a really good mood. This is what I get out of this anyways. Because if we're in a bad mood, we actually use more careful logic to solve a problem, meaning we use more logical, analytical information to solve a problem, okay? When we're in a good mood, on the other hand, is that we're more efficient. Yeah, efficiency, originality, and creativity come out. But we're also more likely to ignore irrelevant information. So when we're in a bad mood, even though we're more logic-based and problem-solving based, we might go down some rabbit hole, as you would say. We might go off and, oh, this irrelevant information, that's interesting, let me go this direction. Okay, but when we're in a good mood, we tend to stick to whatever it is we're working on. So, and we're more likely to be creative and original when we're in that mood. So if you're going to write a story, do it in a good mood. Makes you wonder about Stephen King. He was in a good mood when he wrote that stuff. Thanks. I really don't want to get into intelligent testing too much, but there is some information that you want to know as we get into developmental psych and when we get into abnormal psych. And that's when we determine someone has what's called a developmental disorder or an intellectual disorder, is intelligence tests. What they're supposed to measure is your ability to do a task based upon the population. Okay, so in a lot of the intelligence tests, it tests a lot about kind of what we do in classes and those kinds of things, where it's solving a problem using logic to come to a logical conclusion. Math is part of it, reading is part of it, and what we find is that we get this, what we call a bell curve when we measure intelligence, okay? Everything in the nature, when you measure it enough, will develop a bell curve. Even when you measure the growth of plants, there'll be an average size, and then there'll be plants that are bigger, and there'll be plants that are smaller, and it creates this kind of bell curve, okay? The way to think about this is anything under the bell curves represents someone. It represents the population, okay? And so when we look at an intelligence test, the average score is 100, okay? And then it has what's called a standard deviation of 15, okay? So we go from 100 down to 84, down to 68. And up here, we go from 116, 132 to 148. All right. Most people, in fact, 68% of people will be in one standard deviation of the mean of 100. So most everyone scores between 85 to 115. And then 98% of the population scores within the second deviation between 60, and while it's more like 70 to 130 is what 98. Anything beyond that is what we call outliers. They're within the 2% mark, okay? Usually we consider individuals who have an intellectual disorder or a developmental disorder is someone who scores below a 68, okay? We consider someone who, quote unquote, in the high areas of intelligence. We don't use the word superior anymore. Scores above a 130, okay? Why don't we consider these people that score 130 and above more superior than people who are below that? It's because once someone scores above about a 130, especially if they score above a 140, their behaviors start to be the same and their performance start to become the same as people who scored a 68 and below. Meaning that they almost act like, or actually they do behave like and think like someone with a developmental or intellectual disorder. So it's kind of like this, you know, do you want to be super intelligent? I wouldn't recommend it. And somewhere between the best performers, the people who are most successful in the world, score somewhere between an 85 and a 115. Okay? And those tend to be the most highly successful people because they tend to be the most social people. And what we know about success relies on other people. But once we get above this point, we start to get people who don't like to socialize. Socializing is too much for these people. And they tend to, in fact, the majority, it's interesting, the majority of people who score above 130 are in menial type jobs, right? There was a person who actually followed super intelligent people and then a control group of average intelligent people. And he followed them over about a 50-year time period. Because what he wanted to prove is that superior intelligent people would become the future leaders, the judges, the senators, the president, and it won't be the average person. His results were actually very disappointing because it was actually the people with an average intelligence who became the judges, the senators, the community leaders, the CEOs. People who scored above a 130 tended to be people who did menial jobs most of their life, such as construction or, and don't get me wrong, those are good jobs, but they tended to do jobs that weren't in a leadership role. It was interesting, a couple of them were actually janitors of schools or maintenance individuals of schools. Their superior intelligence didn't determine where they were on the career lattice, as you would say, which is kind of interesting. The other issue that I would say with intelligence is it was also assumed that intelligence is fixed, that it's genetically predetermined, and that there's nothing you can do about how intelligent you can become, okay? But what we have found is that biology only sets the limits of your intellect, okay? So from a biological perspective, I know this sounds silly, you can get less, there's a certain point where you can't get less intelligent, all right? So if you scored above like 68, unless you get some type of brain damage, you'll probably never score below a 68. Okay. And same with an upper limit. Once we get to a certain point, biologically, we won't score any higher. So biology sets the boundaries, but it's environment that determines where you'll score within those boundaries. Okay. So, for example, if you came to college scoring 100, what we have found is once you're done with your bachelor's degree, you'll score around 115. Okay. Another good example of this is that there's a test where you read analogies, and then you try to solve that analogy. Okay, and this analogy test scores equivalent to an intelligence test. In fact, it's probably one of the easiest tools to assess someone's intelligence because you don't have to go through all these tests. You just have them do this analogy and you score it, and there it is, and it's equivalent to a full test. And we had individuals who scored around a 90 come in on a full intelligence test. And what we had them do is we randomly divided the people into either they're going to read the test as it is printed and do the test that way, or some people will take the test and are really hard to read a print. Okay, so some sapphire or something like that. That's really hard to read. Okay, we found the people who read the test and completed the test in the regular font scored right around where they were, 90. Okay. Interestingly, the people who scored the hard to read tests scored, their scores went from 90 to about 105 to 110. All right. And the question that we have is, why do we see this gain in intelligence? Okay. And the reason is that the people who read the hard to read test had to do deep processing. They couldn't use that automatic system that we use to solve a problem. They had to think about what they were reading. They had to really concentrate on it versus the other one where they just read it and just kind of generally went through it. So the point being is that the more you focus on something, the more attention you provide it, the more likely you will solve it in more of an intellectual way or using higher levels of intelligence to solve that problem. So just some thoughts on that. I'm going to come back to cultural bias when we get to developmental psychology, because we'll see that environment does determine what type of intelligence is necessary for a person to survive. And we'll find that a lot of the intelligence tests that we use here in the Western cultures and Western world don't really apply to other cultures, okay? Because we're measuring the wrong, in some instances, we're measuring the wrong type of intelligence it takes for one group of people to survive in an environment versus another group. Okay, and we'll come to a theory. It's Piaget's developmental theory, where you go from sensory up to abstract thinking in stages. And we'll find that some cultures, for example, indigenous Amazon cultures, will only get through the first or two stages. Whereas in the Western culture, we'll get to more of the third or fourth stage. But that does not make us more intelligent than those individuals who are in the Amazon. The answer is no. Because for them to survive in their world, they just need a knowledge of their environment itself. If you take someone from the West and have them go explore the Amazon, they'll probably need an indigenous guide. They'll need tents. They'll need to bring their own food. They'll need to bring their own navigation gear. They'll need a whole bunch of things in order for them to survive in that environment. versus the people who live there who just know how to navigate it. So dependent upon the situation really determines what type of intelligence we need. Okay. We talked about hereditability, and we do know that intelligence does increase over age and experience. And the last thing is the Flynn effect. Okay. Believe it or not, and you can go home and tell your parents this. You can go home and say, Mom, Dad, I'm more intelligent than Einstein. Because really, when we give you a test, we have to adjust it almost every decade. Okay? Because what we find is let's say he scored a 130. Compared to today's students, you guys, he would score on an intelligence test probably around 90, between 80 and 90. Okay. This is what's called the Flynn effect, where we find that as generations rotate, the generations are actually getting more and more intelligent. And I know that's hard to believe, but on a test of intelligence, let's put it that way, we find that Einstein would probably score 90 today, where he would have scored 130 back when he was alive, I should say. So go home and tell Mom and Dad that. And this is just an example of the Flynn effect. So 1932 compared to 1997, we have a 20-point jump in intelligence scores. So. And we don't usually use the word gifted anymore. And intellectual disability, I gotta take that one out. Okay. And we talked about the IQ, those kinds of things. All right. I'm gonna go over that. All right. Stop recording. They don't use gifted anymore? Not really, because we find that there's a certain level of intelligence where quote unquote gifted individuals no longer can function. And we're finding that, you know, when we look at a gifted person, so let's say they're a gifted piano player, right? We find that they tend to only be gifted in that domain, but they struggle in other domains of their life. And so usually when we talk about gifted, we're only speaking about a certain domain of life, like piano playing or something like that. And so when we talk